I'm nominated Associate Director of JCRC. In a moment, I'll have the honor of introducing our keynote speaker, David Eisenhower, a distinguished professor who's devoted his life to the study and teaching of history, political science, and public service. Though I've had the pleasure of meeting Professor Eisenhower only today, our family connection actually goes back a generation or two. 70 years ago, the concentration camps were liberated and the gates to hell opened. But as so many of us gathered here today know all too well, the nightmare was far from over for Jewish survivors. There were no real plans for what would happen after the liberation, other than to repatriate the displaced persons back to their countries of origin, many of which were countries where their neighbors participated in the slaughter of their people, and whose soil was soaked with the blood of their families. Returning to countries that had been transformed into mass graveyards was just unthinkable. So the Jews languished in displaced persons camps, where they faced conditions often as deplorable as those under the Nazis. General Dwight Eisenhower committed to implementing a vigorous plan to provide the special care and attention that was so desperately needed. And as part of that plan, he created a new and unprecedented position, Advisor on Jewish Affairs, someone to provide guidance on the extraordinarily sensitive and arduous work ahead. My father, Rabbi and then Chaplain Judah Nadich, was the first person appointed to that post. For the next few months, my father visited the DP camps, reported on conditions, and made recommendations to Eisenhower on how best to address the overwhelming and complex needs of the displaced Jews. His recommendations, readily adopted by the general, included raising the standards of health, clothing, shelter, and nutrition to heal the wounded bodies of those who had survived. But they also focused on healing their souls by addressing the educational and recreational needs of children, the occupational needs of adults, and perhaps most important, by reigniting a sense of hope and purpose among those who had suffered so unimaginably. At one point, my father requested permission from Eisenhower for a visit that he knew would provide such encouragement. He asked for and was granted permission for the head of the Jewish agency in Palestine, David Ben-Gurion, to enter the American zone and visit a DP camp. My father brought Ben-Gurion for an emotional visit to a camp where throngs surrounded this man who represented the very embodiment of their most fervent dreams, that they would someday reach Palestine. As they greeted him, they broke out in spontaneous singing of the Jewish anthem, Hatikvah. My father and General Eisenhower maintained their connection through the years. 50 years ago this spring, marking the 20th anniversary of the liberation, my father welcomed Eisenhower to his pulpit at the Park Avenue Synagogue, where the general and former president was honored as a hero of the Jewish people. It could not be more fitting to welcome his grandson here today, as we bear witness to the story that must continue to be told, and as we honor the strength and resilience of our survivors and the heroism of our liberators. Please join me in welcoming David Eisenhower.
Mayor Walsh, Chairman Mann, Chairman Dershowitz, Director Burton, Max Michelson, distinguished guests on the platform, survivors and liberators, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. In today's program, Liberation from Darkness to Light, we are establishing or re-establishing a connection with memories of the Holocaust and with the people who endured it, indeed the people who transcended it. Again, we attempt to understand this event, to promote greater awareness of it, greater sensitivity to the effects of indifference, to the effects of neutrality in the face of evil, and to resolve individually to never forget and to become better people. Now, time passes, and so those with a direct connection to the Holocaust are fewer these days. This is the 20th anniversary of the dedication of the Holocaust Memorial here in Boston, the 70th anniversary of the liberation of the camps. In fact, we've been passing through a number of very significant anniversaries over the past several years, 70th and 50th and 100th anniversaries, which mark the passage of the years. On April 12, 1945, the world discovered Buchenwald, which had been reached by the U.S. forces the day before. With the passage of time, our connection to these events relies more and more on what we read and on secondhand accounts. We remain privileged today and deeply honored by the presence of the survivors and family members of survivors, Max Michelson and others. And also, again, it is wonderful to renew my association with Nomi, in fact, to create it, because her father, my grandfather, though we had not met, who served with Dwight Eisenhower in the occupation as a special advisor on Jewish affairs. I had been asked before I arrived here today by members of the Commemoration Committee and by Nomi and others, on behalf of the survivors, to acknowledge that the agony of the camps did not end with their liberation in April of 1945. In fact, I suggest to young people in the audience here today to go to the Holocaust Memorial website and to access an item on that website called the Harrison Report on the treatment of displaced Jews that was published in August of 1945. Dean Harrison, Dean of the University of Pennsylvania Law School, was sent by President Truman to inspect conditions in Europe, and that report provides a very vivid description of conditions in the camps in post-war Austria and Germany. He acknowledged the Herculean efforts that were underway caused by the devastation of the war. Allied forces were attempting to save the lives of hundreds of thousands, to care for survivors. There was the obligation to repatriate people who were liberated in the camp. 6 million people in all. 4 million had been liberated by August of 1945. But in the commission of all of this, a number of prisoners, especially Jews, had been kept in camps. The conditions remained poor. They had no word of their relatives. They had no clear idea where to go. And so the Harrison Report was a response to this, and it galvanized great action. The Harrison Report is significant in a number of ways. Nomi indicated one of them, and that it is a milestone, I believe, in the history of the Holocaust, because it prompted the establishment or the recognition that Jewish displaced persons were, in fact, a special situation, that the survivors had endured extraordinary persecutions and sufferings, unusual, even among the displaced persons, and few wished to return to the places where they had lived before the war. And so this recognition of the unique aspect of the Jewish suffering in World War II marks a milestone, I believe, in the history of the Holocaust. And there is also a recommendation in the report that Nomi sort of touched on, and that was and implemented unevenly over the years, a recommendation by Professor Harrison to assist with the immigration of Jews to Palestine. I believe that American support for Israel was born of this recognition of this need in 1945. Harry Truman would recognize the state of Israel in 1948 within 10 minutes of its creation. We all have connections with this event, direct or indirect. My indirect connection is Dwight Eisenhower, who was the author of an earlier milestone. The connection that brings me here, in fact, is a gesture for which Dwight Eisenhower is known. Reports in the spring, late winter and spring of 1945 had been reaching his headquarters about the camps. And on April 12, 1945, exactly 70 years ago, he decided to visit and inspect Ohrdruf, which was part of the Buchenwald complex, the worst camp uncovered by Allied forces so far. The gesture that he made was to call on the world press as he visited this camp and to require them to make a record of what they saw, and also to call out the surrounding population and to oblige them to form columns and to tour this camp and to see what had been done. He was making of himself a witness as he wrote in Crusade in Europe, quote, "The things I saw beggar description. The visual evidence and the verbal testimony of starvation and bestiality were so overpowering as to leave me a bit sick. I made the visit deliberately in order to be in a position to give first-hand evidence of these things, if ever, in the future, there develops a tendency to charge these allegations merely to propaganda. Dwight Eisenhower was not uninformed on April 12th when he arrived at Ohrdruf. Ohrdruf is not the first camp that Allied forces had overrun or that the Grand Coalition had overrun. Majdanek, a death camp, had been uncovered in July of 1944. Chelmo and Auschwitz had been liberated, overrun in January of 1945. There were literally hundreds in the Allied sectors. But I believe that this was in part to expose his own command, Americans mostly, to a story that they found very, very bewildering, and to encourage them to become witnesses to this story, and to do his part to build the story that we remember and commemorate here today. As eloquent a witness of these times, as eloquent as my grandfather, was my father, who just passed away at the age of 91. John Eisenhower, Dwight Eisenhower's son, was a graduate of West Point on June 6, 1944, D-Day. After training at Fort Benning, he entered the European theater with the 71st Division in January of 1945. Thereafter, he served with a signal intelligence and monitoring battalion. That was the first unit to enter Buchenwald on April 11, 1945. As my father put it, or recalled, he did not speak of it a great deal. He wrote about it in his memoir. The idea of bringing in photographers and the press was something that actually originated within the camp. When he entered the camp, he felt self-conscious. He actually attempted to conceal a camera that he was carrying on his person. Several survivors came forward and insisted that he take pictures, take more pictures. Never let anybody forget this. 35 years later, on a rainy afternoon in Dad's living room, I happened upon a photo album that I had never seen before, and it contained all the developed snapshots that my father took that day at Buchenwald. I asked Dad what his feelings were when he encountered the camp, and he said, "David, that is like asking, how many grains of sand are there on a beach?" Such words mattered to my father. A metaphor like that he applied very sparingly. He was a writer, but he applied it to large questions, questions of religion, questions of existence. For him and Americans and the world, the camps were the discovery of a new reality. This reality perplexed Americans in particular, as Ronald Reagan explained to a group of survivors in 1983, quote, "Our whole way of life is based on a compact between good and decent people. And yet the world at large, even the world at large, not just Americans, encountered something novel as well." In a radio address in 1941, Winston Churchill, after reporting on conditions and reporting on war developments shortly after the German invasion of Russia, warned darkly, quote, "We are in the presence of a crime without a name." 2 years later, the name was applied by a Polish attorney, genocide. A crime so devastating that to bring justice, so devastating in the words of Justice Jackson, that international law had to be expanded in order to bring indictments against the perpetrators of the Holocaust. A crime so devastating that not even the higher-ups of the Nazi hierarchy tried at Nuremberg would even endorse or even acknowledge that they had known a policy which had been executed in their name. So devastating that the principal authors of the policy, Hitler and Himmler, would not even speak its name to each other, except in euphemisms and in secret correspondence, and both would commit suicide rather than account for their actions. So devastating that its victims, according to so much testimony that I have read, could not even conceive of their fate as they were being rounded up until the very end. And yet, it happened. And because it happened, the world changed. And so it is important to try to understand how the world changed, and important to set our minds that the world, and to set our minds on what the world of post-1945 requires of us. I believe that it requires more than just simply understanding, as elusive as that can be. But we are attempting to understand, and I think that in so doing here today on April 12th, it is important to recognize the elements of hope as well as tragedy that we can derive from this epical event. One aspect of this that is hopeful is the wider awareness of the event, if not universal awareness of the Holocaust, which makes repetition, I believe, less likely simply because people are aware of a possibility that they were unaware of in the 1930s. There is a question that arises amidst a state-sanctioned drive to extinguish a people, a culture, and a religion. And that question is, can the captors succeed in eliminating in their captives, those who escape physical destruction, any sense of love, of empathy, loyalty, kindness, empathy, faith in the future? Elie Wiesel's Night contains, in its various versions, published several times, some much longer than others and so forth, contains a very hard and a very hopeful answer to that question. It is hard and hopeful he does not forgive his captors, but he does forgive the world, provided that the world will resolve to act in the face of injustice. The survivors here provide a resounding answer to that question. Their lives answer that question. But the example of their lives is that you cannot extinguish their humanity. And what actions does the event command of us, in addition to understanding? I commend the essays that are prize winners here today, and the two authors that are on the dais, which I have read their essays, and I think that they are very significant. Donald Baptiste's essay is about a recent disaster which resembles the kind of situation that a kind of Holocaust in Africa. He described a nightmare of murder and abuse that he experienced. These have inspired him to want to serve. They have inspired him to want to build an orphanage. In Don Jean's essay, he writes of the respect that he now knows that he must show for others. And he also writes that this is, in effect, a matter of self-respect. He is resolved to become a better person. Madison Lomax writes of a subtler challenge that we face day to day, of combating attitudes, bullying, the impulse to make fun of a Down syndrome child. For Madison, not being silent and taking sides means risking friendships and defying peer pressure. But like Jean-Baptiste, she recognizes that in respect for others, she is respecting herself. She is resolved to become a better person. Both write of their resolve to be active, more empathetic, to steel their courage when courage is necessary, and to apply the teachings of this commemoration. I think that today this inspires, and their actions and their writings inspire confidence that there is wider awareness of the Holocaust today, in fact, universal awareness of the Holocaust today, and that this can lead to action before the fact, thereby perhaps averting the epic loss of life and dislocations of 70 plus years ago. For 70 plus years ago, in a more innocent world, without general awareness or a general willingness to acknowledge the gathering storm, it fell to just a handful of people to educate the world and to mobilize efforts to defeat this evil. First, there were the testimonies of intellectuals who were fleeing Europe. Second, in the debates, voices arose. I quote Churchill, the prophet, a man of vast comprehension and experience, perhaps the first to see the gathering storm in England, who in the course of the war not only recognized the enemy early, but went on to acquire the power to defeat it. On the eve of becoming Prime Minister, on September 3rd, 1939, Churchill in the Commons said, "This war is not a question of fighting for Danzig or fighting for Poland. We are fighting to save the whole world from the pestilence of Nazi tyranny and in defense of all that is most sacred to man. This is no war of domination or imperial aggrandizement or material gain, no war to deny any country. its sunlight. It is a war rooted in its inherent quality to establish on impregnable rocks the rights of the individual, and to establish and to revive the stature of man. The stature of man. The war that ended 70 years ago was a crusade to revive the stature of man. And it could not succeed completely since the world reacted to the threat too unevenly and too late to save millions of lives. But there were survivors and other witnesses who have left immortal accounts of their experiences, and so we can learn and we can understand and we can resolve to act in the face of evil. I will say that as an historian, I have watched the historiography of the war change significantly in my lifetime. I undertook a major publishing project in the 1970s. Then there was a television series called The Holocaust. Herman Woot was publishing his books and so forth, and almost palpably one can begin to see the emphasis in all histories of World War II begin to shift. Steadily, what we call the Holocaust today has emerged as the central event of World War II. It was the central event of World War II. And we can hope that awareness of that provides some comfort to the families that still grieve, awareness that the systematic effort to erase European Jews from history resulted in their elevation as martyrs, according to them, undying, eternal stature. They did not live or die in vain, and in fact, this year, this week, and next, people will come together to commemorate their move from darkness to light, to resolve on their names, never again. We will never forget. We will not be silent whenever people suffer. We must always take the side of good, and we all must strive to be better. Thank you.